Hi everyone, this is Elias Martin of CollectingJapanesePrints.com. Welcome to Woodblock Wednesday, where on Wednesdays we get together and discuss Japanese prints, paintings, history, and culture. It's wonderful to be with all of you today. I've done this in a couple of weeks and missed our time together. People were asking me, "Where are you? Where are your Woodblock Wednesdays?" And the last couple of weeks were kind of challenging. I was having some back problems. So I had some sciatica issues, and so it wasn't easy for me to sort of walk around even. That's kind of crazy, but I turned 46 last December, and I'm starting to feel it. So I'm hoping that the spring and the warmer weather will allow me to do a lot more things outside, and then that will help. But thank you, all of you who have expressed concern and asked me what was going on, and so that's what's happening. But now I'm feeling much better, and I'm back, and I'm actively working on my next exhibition that will be going live on collectingjapaneseprints.com very soon. I anticipate the exhibition to go up in 2 to 3 weeks, certainly this month, and it promises to be an excellent exhibition. There'll be a wide variety of different and very important prints and paintings in this exhibition. And I thought I'd bring out one major work that will be in the exhibition to share with all of you. I don't believe we've discussed the work of Toko Shinoda before in Woodblock Wednesday, and she's a terribly important artist, prolific, but very important, and so I want to discuss her work, and I have a work that she produced towards the later period of her life that is just iconic, and a wonderful design to sort of discuss, and this work sort of encompasses her entire work, in fact. So without further ado, let's go to look at the table, see what I have. So this is a very large print. It's a lithograph produced by Toko Shinoda. And for those of you who are not sort of aware of her, she is one of Japan's more important abstract artists. She was born in 1913 in Manchuria, which was occupied China. And I should also give you her end date. She passed away very recently. She passed away in 2021, and so early last year. And so she lived to be 107, believe it or not. And so Toko Shinoda, I mean, I've done exhibitions on her work years ago that were, it was very successful, and she's so iconic and she's so prolific that she's also, because of it, very well known around the world. And this work is, as I said, it's a lithograph that showcases everything you ever want to see in a Toko Shinoda print. But before we discuss the print, I want to give you a little bit of background information on her that kind of helps us understand her work and what her project as an artist was throughout her life. So, as I mentioned, she was born in Manchuria, which was occupied China, and of course, everyone that went and occupied China was sent back and were repatriated. And Toko Shinoda mentioned that, as a repatriated Japanese citizen, she kind of didn't feel truly Japanese. And that was because the Japanese themselves sort of kind of treated her differently. And because of that, she kind of expressed not necessarily regret. In fact, she felt like it liberated her. And so she was always interested in art. And as a woman, there weren't that many opportunities to produce artwork. And so when she came back, well, her family and her returned to Japan, she sort of expressed interest in art and sort of pursued that, despite the fact that it would be, by all indications, a very hard path to take in life as a woman. And even as any person, artists were something that was fairly new. It wasn't until the Meiji period that even the idea of an artist emerged. It was mostly artisans that produced artwork, and so she continued on the path, and in fact, she started showing in New York City in the 50s. And in fact, there was an exhibition at MoMA in I think 1953 that featured her work. And so she was really interested in abstraction and working in abstraction at the right time. And she was, New York was the center of the world for abstract expressionism at the time. And so she did actually move there. She moved there in 1955 and stayed there until 1958. And it was a really wonderful time for her because she was exposed to all of the American expressionists. And, she saw their work, met them, and so there's this wonderful opportunity for her to sort of digest that sort of influence by different artists like Pollock and de Kooning and Franz Klein. And her work does, exhibit that quality. I mean, in the sense that, honestly, her work from the period was very, very much similar to what we're looking at even now. So it's not as if, she went to New York with a completely different style and emerged an abstract expressionist. She very much had that style already as she sort of entered into the abstract expressionist world in New York City. But there was a really interesting sort of conversation that occurred in the art world in New York, and she was certainly part of it. Her work was shown at Betty Parsons' gallery, who, Betty Parsons was one of the foremost gallerists in New York City at the time, showing de Kooning, Franz Klein, I believe even Pollock showed there as well as Rothko and others. So she was one of the most important gallerists in New York, and Toko Shinoda showed her work there as well. And when we come across her larger scale work from that period, those paintings, you even see the Betty Parsons Gallery label on the back of those paintings. So it's really neat. Now, she returned to Japan in the late 50s, and by 1960 or early 60s, she started doing large-scale lithography. And so this is an example of the work that she started producing in the 60s and continued to produce up until the last part of her life. This work was done in 2003, and so it's nearly 20 years old. But at the time, she was approaching 100 years. She was in her 90s. And so, or late 80s, I'm not going to do math right now. But the point is, she was doing this kind of large-scale work up until the very last part of her life. She, I think in the last few years, she was primarily just working in painting on paper. But she was still producing smaller prints, certainly at the age of 100. And so this is one of her last works done in this scale. And just to give you a sense of scale, I'm going to walk back a little bit. You could see that the print pretty much takes up most of my table. There is a book here that gives you a sense of scope of how large the print is. And you see how wonderfully large this piece is. It's resting on a sheet of paper. I always like to put my prints on top of a archival sheet of paper so that they don't pick up any, oils or anything from the table. I always clean my table before I present prints on the table, but nonetheless, I always like to keep a piece of paper just in case to protect the print. And so you could see how wonderful this print is. It's in pristine condition. In fact, the original owner of this print has never framed it. he kept it loose like this, and he stored it in a flat file. And so it now is in my hands, and I'm very excited to be able to present something like this in my upcoming exhibition. And so, let's talk about the actual work. The piece is created with a lithographic process, and that's most of the design. So this wonderful rich red, this black, that is done with the lithographic stone process. However, the white here, which is slightly opaque but also translucent, you could kind of see through it, but in areas you can't. It's interesting. It creates kind of a three-dimensional effect. This is applied by hand, and so is this gold streak going across it. And so prints like this obviously were produced as a very small editioned art, high quality work of art. And so the edition here is 28, which is a very small edition for Shinoda. Previously, she was working in editions of 50, 100, 150. I've even seen editions of 250. But towards the end of her life, certainly now in her 80s, I don't think she was working in that large scale in terms of quantity, because even though she had her printers were some of the best printers in the world, she had to embellish the prints themselves by hand, and so these embellishments, would take a lot out of her, and they have to be precise. And if I had two or three of these designs side by side, you would see differences, and that makes these works, you could say that each work is unique, because it is. There obviously the design is the same, but the location of this white sort of squarish object, as well as the gold streak, it's impossible to capture, perfectly every single time by hand. And even the background, the red, the way that it's been applied, you see how the whiteness, there's like a white color that's peeking through the red. It almost looks like this was done by hand, and that's intentional. But no, not everything looks precisely the same from print to print. And I think that's what makes Shinoda's work really interesting. And as a collector, you want to be able to have something that is recognizable, but at the same time, it's nice to have something that's also unique. And Shinoda's work is really a wonderful marriage of those two qualities. And so let me come in so you could actually see the work more closely and appreciate how wonderful the printing is in this design. The color printed on this impression is so rich and vibrant. That background red is just it's so vibrant, but it's also printed in a really flat sort of manner, which is really interesting backdrop for this portion of the design that is not well, it's applied by hand, and so it doesn't have that same quality, and it's translucent in most parts of the figure, and it creates this really wonderful conversation between the surface sort of quality. It almost reads as if there's something three-dimensional floating above this flat back of the red, or even the black is also done in that strong black matte. So it's really interesting design. And the print is titled Him again. There's her signature, very distinctive signature, dated 2003, 26 out of 28. And so for her body of work, it's interesting as a collector and fan of her work, I have to say that some of the most compelling designs she produced were done towards the end of her life. I've seen a lot of these paintings they're just fantastic pieces, and she was producing this in the 2000s. And when you think about an artist with such a long career that produced such an enormous amount of work, I mean, she made a lot of prints. She made a lot of prints, particularly in the 60s and 70s. I really enjoy those prints, but for my money and to my taste, I think her early paintings and her early prints and her later period prints and paintings are just, for some reason, in my opinion, stronger. And so this design is really iconic. I mean, she's known for applying this black sort of splash that adds drama to the design, and it's always coming from one side against another. And then of course there's also a little bit of gold there. And I should also point out that in a lot of her work, there's calligraphic influences. And though this print, you can't specifically say, well, it looks like calligraphy. For example, the print on the front cover of this book, that does look like calligraphy, and a lot of her prints do have that aspect. Nonetheless, the gesture of how this work was done with this brush-like stroke is very calligraphic, and it harkens back to the calligraphic works of the Zen Buddhist monks that would do calligraphy that was inspired by a movement, which would then encourage maybe a adherent to that type of Buddhism, a certain sense of enlightenment. And so, that sense of movement is quite prevalent and present in this print, though you can't say that's a character because it's not, but it still has that significant quality. Years ago, I did an exhibition for another gallery on Toko Shinoda, and I called that exhibition Brush as Blade. And I did that because I do see these works as almost like the same as a brush stroke, but also in some ways like the stroke of a sword going across. They're very lyrical, but they're very powerful, very dramatic, very potent designs that I just love. And as an artist, Toko Shinoda really put her emotional sort of power out in her work. When you look at a print like this, some people who've never seen a Shinoda work, who don't even who are not familiar with Shinoda, mistake it as a work from a man. They would say, oh, it's very there's a certain sense of violence, or there's a certain sense of power. And it's interesting. I've heard that from people who were just looking at Shinoda's work for the first time. But what I see is I do see a power there, absolutely, and I do. But I also see a grace, and I also see sort of a mindfulness of tradition and contemplation, and being able to sort of strike when the time is right, and then at the same time, contemplate things in a more passive way. This design has both qualities. The backdrop has this quiet, contemplative, sort of white or whitish or pinkish sort of square figure in sort of concert with this really wonderful bright red backdrop, and then this wonderful, powerful stroke. I love this print, and I'm a big fan of Toko Shinoda's work. The art world certainly lost a giant when she passed away last year. But as I said, she left an enormous amount of work that will help us appreciate her for generations to come. And luckily, because there is such an amount of work out there, you could find her prints and paintings at different price points. The smaller scale designs, are pretty affordable as things go, and so this larger scale print is obviously much more, but nonetheless, compared to work by her contemporaries like Pollock, de Kooning, Franz Klein, Motherwell, if you find prints by those artists, yeah, they're going to be tens of thousands of dollars, maybe 100,000. I'm thinking of Solage, a post-war abstract painter from France. His prints sell for his small prints sell for 20 to 30,000, and something of this size would sell for a couple 100,000. And quite frankly, I love Solage. He produces work that's mostly influenced by black on black, and then you kind of see a little bit of splash of color, and it's more about the brush strokes and the surface of the painting. But even his prints are interesting. But Shinoda, personally, I believe that produced much more compelling graphic work. She was a master at making prints and being able to marry such a strong calligraphic graphic design that would look great as a painting, but also on paper. And I think, as I mentioned, these hand embellished elements within the composition really go they go a long way at producing something that is both compelling, harmonious, and for the print collector, something that is really interesting. So, okay, I've spoken a lot. Now I just want to zoom in so you could see the actual work. As I'm panning across the print, I'm looking at the comments, and someone just said it's like a flying crane in front of a Rothko picture. Yes, Orsi, thank you for your comment. Absolutely. The backdrop does have kind of a Rothko-esque quality to it. On my phone, I don't know how well it comes through, but the depth of this red, it's a deep red. I'm looking at my screen and there might be a little bit of orange, and that's from this light that's overhead. But the background is actually kind of a rich, deep red that seems to go deep into infinity. And then there's these objects sort of floating around in front of this backdrop. And yes, there is this wonderful sort of abstracted like figure that does remind me of a crane as well. Yeah. It's almost as if, I mean, not to compare her work to Rothko, but these artists were her contemporaries, and she was shown in New York. It's as if she deconstructed elements from different artists and then kind of assembled them in a different way, which is kind of fascinating. There is this bold sort of color going across that reminds us of Rothko and other color field artists. But then there's these other elements like the black abstracted, like almost stroke of a big brush that reminds us of Franz Klein. So, there's all these different elements, but they work so harmoniously under her sort of control. So, I could go on and on talking about Shinoda. And so it's kind of, now that I think about my Woodblock Wednesdays, I've been doing them for a couple years now, and I'm surprised that I haven't done one on Shinoda. So I'm glad that, I spent some time speaking about her today. Now, before we move on, I just want to point out an excellent book on Shinoda. There's several books, mostly in Japanese, but this is one of the rare English language books on her, and it was written by Mary and Norman Tolman, who were the publishers of her work. And this is not necessarily a Kellogg raisonné, because it's a book that was produced, more than 30 years ago. So it showcases certainly a lot of her work, and some early work. But this is an excellent book that gives a good overview for Shinoda. And so if you're interested in learning more about her, this is a good book to look for. It's actually not as easy to find. I might have one in my bookstore. I need to check. So if you're interested in the book, shoot me an email and I'll be happy to assist you. And of course, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, this print will be available for sale eventually, not eventually, actually quite soon, later this month at my website, collectingjapaneseprints.com. So let's have a look one last time. I'm thinking about when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking now we've entered the year of the water tiger. So this print certainly has the energy of a tiger. It's really wonderful, vibrant design. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining me on our latest installment of Woodblock Wednesday. As I mentioned earlier, it was great. It's great to be back. I've been out a couple of weeks, had a little bit of some back issues, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the year. I felt like January was kind of rough. Also, COVID was sort of strong. The numbers were on the high side here in Chicago, so that the numbers are coming down. I have a haircut appointment for next week. I'm looking forward to sort of living life again. And though there's a snowstorm right now, I do still see the spring not too far away. So I'm looking forward to that. And of course, you know what I'm looking forward to is sharing the next update on my website. A really wonderful exhibition showcasing masterworks from all genres. And this Shinoda print is certainly among those prints that I would consider a masterpiece. So I want to thank all of you for joining me on Woodblock Wednesday. And I look forward to seeing you next week when we'll discuss another print or painting. Until then, thank you.